Yesterday morning, the deadliest fault in the Pacific cracked open twice in 60 seconds. A magnitude 6.0, then a magnitude 6.6 1 minute later, off the coast of Kamchatka, followed by more than a dozen earthquakes before noon, and a tsunami warning that raced across the North Pacific. Then the sea went still. This is the same fault that sent a wave across the entire ocean in 1952, and what it just did has scientists watching the next few days very closely. Here is what happened, why the wave didn't come, and what comes next. Yesterday morning, off the eastern coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula, the floor of the Pacific Ocean broke open twice in about 60 seconds. The first earthquake was a magnitude 6.0, hitting roughly 156 kilometers east-southeast of the city of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. Then, about 1 minute later, before the shaking from the first one had even faded, the same patch of seafloor ruptured again. And this time it was bigger, a magnitude 6.6. Two major earthquakes, 1 minute apart, in the same small stretch of ocean. That is not how earthquakes usually behave. And it is the reason scientists who watch this part of the world snap to attention. Most large earthquakes are loners. You get one main shock, and then a series of smaller aftershocks that fade away as the fault settles. What happened off Kamchatka was different. Two shocks of nearly the same large size, back-to-back, almost on top of each other. Seismologists call that an earthquake doublet. And a doublet is a warning sign, because it means the first rupture did not release all the pressure. It means the energy is still being passed along the fault, with one break setting off the next. And the moment you understand that, an obvious and frightening question follows. If the first quake triggered the second, what stops the second from triggering a third? The location is the part you need to hold on to, because it is the whole reason this matters. These earthquakes hit just off Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, a city of roughly 180,000 people near the southern tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Russian Far East. That city sits directly above one of the most dangerous faults on the planet, a place that has, within living memory, produced one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded. We will get to exactly what this fault is capable of. For now, picture nearly 200,000 people living on the edge of it, waking up yesterday to the ground breaking twice before they could react. The two main shocks were shallow, only a handful of kilometers below the seafloor by one estimate. And shallow is what makes this dangerous rather than routine. A shallow, violent rupture under the ocean is exactly the setup that can lift the sea into a tsunami. So when the seafloor off Kamchatka heaved twice in 1 minute, the alarm did not wait. But the doublet was only the beginning, because the fault was not finished, not even close. The aftershocks did not trickle in. They came in a flood. After the doublet, the same small box of ocean floor kept rupturing, again and again for hours. A magnitude 4.9, then a 5.0, then another 4.9, then a 4.5. And then, well into the sequence, a magnitude 5.8 followed by a 5.2. By the time the morning was over, more than a dozen earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater had struck this one stretch of the Kamchatka coast in a single morning. That is an extraordinary amount of energy released in one place, in one short window of time. Understand what that count actually means, because the number undersells it. A magnitude 4.5 earthquake is not nothing. On its own, in a populated area, it can crack walls and rattle an entire town. We are talking about more than a dozen of those, or stronger, stacked one on top of another. In a piece of ocean you could cross by boat in a couple of hours. That is not a fault quietly settling down. That is a large area of the seafloor breaking apart in pieces, and continuing to break long after the main shocks. There is one detail in that barrage that made scientists lean in, and it is the magnitude 5.8. It arrived late, and it was large. In a normal sequence, the aftershocks should get weaker as time passes, the fault running out of energy. A strong aftershock showing up well into the sequence, nearly as big as anything before it, is a sign that the fault still has a great deal left to give. It is a sign that the system has not calmed down, and that no one can yet say where the bottom of this sequence is. That uncertainty, the not knowing where it ends, is the feeling that defined yesterday for the people watching it. A long sequence like this does something a single earthquake does not, and it is worth naming. One earthquake is over in seconds, and then the survivors can begin to take stock. A barrage never lets you take stock, because every time you start to believe it is finished, the ground moves again. That is corrosive in a way the numbers alone do not capture. It is also a physical threat, because buildings weakened by the first major shock are then tested again and again by every aftershock that follows. The main shock cracks a structure, and the aftershocks finish the job. On a coast lined with a city of nearly 200,000 people, that repeated punishment is its own danger, separate from any single quake in the list. Now think about living through that. Picture Petropavlovsk-Kamchatka yesterday morning, a city used to shaking ground, suddenly enduring not one earthquake, but a continuous, hours-long sequence of them. The first jolt, then the second, larger one, then the long line of aftershocks, each one asking the same question the scientists were asking through their instruments. Is it over, or is this the start of something worse? On most faults, that question would be paranoia. On this one, it is exactly the right question to ask. And to understand why, you have to understand what is grinding away beneath Kamchatka. 1 minute after the largest earthquake, a tsunami warning went out across the North Pacific. At 6 minutes past 7 in the morning, 60 seconds after that magnitude 6.6, the warning system issued an alert, centered out near the Commander Islands, the scatter of land between Kamchatka and the Aleutians. For a stretch of time yesterday, the official word to a swath of the Northern Pacific was the most frightening word the ocean sciences can broadcast: tsunami. That warning fired so fast for a reason. When a large, shallow earthquake strikes under the ocean, the people who run tsunami warning centers have only minutes, sometimes only seconds, to decide whether to tell coastlines a wave might be coming. They cannot wait for certainty, because for the nearest coasts, a tsunami can arrive in minutes. So the system is built to move fast and err toward caution. A big, shallow quake under the Pacific gets a warning immediately, on the assumption that it might have lifted the sea. That is the system working exactly as designed. And then the wave did not come. There was no destructive tsunami. The sea stayed essentially flat, and the warning was stood down. So we are left with something that sounds like a contradiction. 2 major earthquakes broke the Pacific seafloor 60 seconds apart. An emergency tsunami warning went out, and then nothing happened to the water. How do you square that? The answer is not that the warning was a mistake. A warning that fires without a wave is not a false alarm in the way people mean it. It is the system choosing caution when there is no time to be sure. The reason the wave did not come comes down to the physics of how earthquakes move water. And that physics depends on details most people never think about. The kind of details that separate a quiet morning from a drowned coastline. We will get to those details, because on this fault they are the whole game. But first, you need to understand why this particular fault is treated as one of the deadliest on Earth. Underneath that stretch of ocean, 2 of the planet's tectonic plates are locked in a collision that never stops. The Kamchatka Peninsula sits where the Pacific Plate dives beneath the edge of Asia, plunging into the hot interior of the Earth along a boundary called the Kuril-Kamchatka subduction zone. This is the machine that built Kamchatka's volcanoes, and it is the machine that produced yesterday's earthquakes. Understanding how it works is the key to understanding why a doublet here is so alarming. Picture 2 enormous slabs of rock pressed together, one trying to slide beneath the other. They do not move smoothly. The Pacific Plate is creeping downward at about 80 millimeters a year, roughly the speed your fingernails grow. But the plates do not glide. They catch. They lock together along their contact, snagged by friction, and they stay locked for decades while the pressure keeps building, the rock bending like a spring, being wound tighter and tighter. Then, in a few violent seconds, the lock breaks, and all that stored energy is released at once. That is an earthquake. And on a subduction zone like this one, the locked area can be enormous, which is why these boundaries produce the largest earthquakes on the planet. The Kuril-Kamchatka zone is one of the most productive earthquake factories anywhere on Earth. It subducts an old, cold, fast-moving slab along a long, well-developed boundary, and the result is a margin that generates great earthquakes with terrifying regularity. So when more than a dozen strong earthquakes, including a doublet of major shocks, fire off along this exact boundary in a single morning, it is not background noise. It is the machine reminding everyone that it is still loaded, still pushing, still winding the spring. And the ceiling on what this machine can do is not a magnitude 6 or 7. It is far higher, and we know that because we have seen it. And this is what explains the missing wave from yesterday morning. The size of an earthquake is not what decides whether it drowns a coast. What matters is how the ground moved and how far below the seafloor it broke. When a fault thrusts upward, it heaves the entire column of water above it and launches a tsunami. And that is the kind of rupture that produced the giant wave of 1952. But when the ground mostly slides sideways, even violently, it barely disturbs the sea, because shoving water sideways does not pile it up. The most likely reason the Pacific stayed flat yesterday is that these particular ruptures moved more sideways than upward, or sat a little farther down than the worst case, or both. That is a statement about these specific quakes, not about the fault. The same boundary, with a clean upward thrust on a shallow locked patch, is exactly the setup that sends a wave across an ocean. The fault did not spare the coast because it is gentle. It spared the coast because, this time, the details fell on the safe side of the line. Here is the part that has scientists genuinely on edge, and it is worth stating plainly. Every large earthquake carries a small but real chance of being a foreshock, a warning tremor before an even larger earthquake still to come. Across the global record, that chance sits at a few percent in the days that follow. A few percent is small. It almost never happens. But it is not zero, and a doublet is exactly the scenario where that small number stops feeling abstract. Think about the logic. When that first magnitude 6.0 struck, and the magnitude 6.6 followed 60 seconds later, the most natural reading is that the first rupture changed the stress on the surrounding rock and pushed the next section past its breaking point. This is real, well-documented physics. Earthquakes redistribute stress. When one patch of a fault slips, it can load the neighboring patch even more heavily, the way pulling one log from a jam throws the weight of the river onto the next one. A doublet is direct, visible proof that the earthquakes out there are talking to each other, that one rupture can provoke the next. And the unavoidable question is whether that conversation is finished. That is why the honest word for what scientists feel right now is nervous, not terrified. Nobody is predicting catastrophe, and anyone who tells you a magnitude 9 is coming this week is not being truthful, because that cannot be known. But nobody is shrugging it off either, because the doublet proved, in real time, that this section of the fault can have one rupture set off a larger one. The most likely outcome, by far, is that the aftershocks fade and nothing worse happens. The worst case is the one this fault has already shown it can produce. Holding both of those at once, without panic and without dismissal, is the actual job. And to see why the worst case is taken so seriously, you have to go back to what this fault did the last time it fully let go. In November of 1952, this exact fault produced a magnitude 9.0 earthquake, one of the largest ever recorded by human instruments. It ruptured along an immense stretch of the Kamchatka margin, and it did not stop at shaking the ground. It generated a tsunami, and that tsunami did not stay home. The waves struck the nearby Kuril Islands with devastating force, overwhelming the town of Severokurilsk and killing a large number of people in a single morning. Then it kept going. It raced across thousands of kilometers of open ocean at the speed of a jetliner and reached the Hawaiian Islands, on the far side of the Pacific, where it tore boats from their moorings and flooded low-lying shores. That is the shadow hanging over yesterday's doublet. When scientists look at a violent sequence on the Kuril-Kamchatka zone, they are not imagining some abstract worst case from a textbook. They are remembering 1952. They are remembering that this specific fault, in this specific water, has already produced a magnitude 9 and sent a killing wave across the widest ocean on Earth. The history does not mean it is about to happen again. It means the worst case here is not theoretical. It is a real event with a real date and a real death toll. That is what makes a small probability on this fault so heavy. And it is why a doublet here gets watched in a way the same doublet somewhere else never would. There is one more reason this history matters today. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky holds far more people now than it did in 1952. Decades of relative calm have let a modern city settle in above a fault that has not shown at the worst in most residents' lifetimes. That is the quiet trap of a long earthquake cycle. The longer the fault stays calm, the more there is to lose when it finally moves, and the more people there are who have never felt why the old warnings exist. A doublet that jolts everyone back to attention is, in a grim way, useful, because it pulls the danger back into view. So what are scientists actually doing while the ground keeps moving? They are reading the aftershocks, and the aftershocks follow rules. There are a handful of mathematical patterns that earthquake sequences obey reliably enough that scientists can use them in real time to judge whether what they are watching is normal or alarming. These patterns are not prediction. They are a running forecast updated by the hour, and they are the closest thing we have to reading the fault's intentions. The first rule says aftershocks fade with time in a predictable way, fast at first, then tapering off. The dense flood off Kamchatka in the first hours was, by this rule, exactly what you would expect after a large main shock, which is reassuring. The real test is whether the rate keeps dropping on schedule. The second rule says the largest aftershock is usually about 1 to 1.25 magnitude units below the main shock. For a magnitude 6.6, that predicts a largest aftershock around 5.4 or 5.5. The sequence produced a 5.8, a touch bigger than the rule expects. And that is exactly the kind of small detail that keeps scientists cautious rather than relaxed. The third rule describes how earthquakes of different sizes relate in number, and the Kamchatka sequence fit the normal shape, which argues against anything exotic and in favor of a powerful but ordinary subduction zone sequence. Put those together and you can feel what the experts feel. The early flood was normal. The overall shape was normal. But the largest aftershock ran a little hot. And the whole thing is happening on the one fault that produced a magnitude 9 within living memory. That combination is why the answer was not panic and was not dismissal. It was watchfulness. And that watchfulness now turns to a single question. What happens next? In the coming days, the thing to watch is whether this sequence keeps fading on schedule. If the aftershocks continue to taper, growing weaker and less frequent the way the patterns predict, that is the signal that this fault is settling back down, and the doublet was a violent but contained event. If instead the rate stops dropping, or a new shock arrives that rivals the main ones, that would be the warning that the situation is escalating rather than ending. The foreshock window, that small chance of a larger event, narrows as each quiet hour passes, which is why the first days after a doublet are when scientists watch most closely. Here's what this means in practice, and it is the opposite of helplessness. We cannot predict the exact next earthquake on this fault, and we cannot stop it. But the people who live above it can be ready, and readiness is what saves lives. For any coastal community near a major fault, the rule is simple, and it needs no scientist to interpret it. If the ground shakes hard enough that you cannot stand, or it shakes for a long stretch, and you are near the coast, you move to high ground immediately. You do not wait for an official warning, because near the source, the wave can outrun the alert. The earthquake itself is the warning. The people of the Kuril Islands learned that at a terrible cost in 1952, and it remains the single most important thing anyone living in the shadow of this fault can carry. It is also worth being clear about what this sequence is not, because the claims spread fast online after any big quake. It was not triggered by a solar storm, because the sun was quiet yesterday, with no significant activity aimed at Earth, and there is no proven way for space weather to break tectonic plates anyway. It is not evidence that earthquakes worldwide are surging, because the long-term rate of great earthquakes has held steady for decades, and what has changed is only our ability to detect and report them instantly. And it was not engineered by any machine, because the energy of even a single magnitude 6.6 dwarfs anything human technology can deliver into the crust. The cause was the slow, enormous grinding of the Pacific plate beneath Asia, the same engine that has run here for millions of years. So that is where this stands. A doublet and a barrage of aftershocks struck one of the deadliest faults on the planet yesterday. A tsunami warning fired and then stood down. And the most likely outcome is that the sequence quietly fades. But this is the same fault that drowned coastlines across the Pacific in 1952. And it is still locked, still loading, still moving at 80 millimeters a year. The people who watch it will not look away in the days ahead. And on a fault with this record, neither should the rest of us.